I still remember the sound of the fork hitting the plate that night. It was the moment my whole world shattered. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The smell of roasted turkey, the warmth of cinnamon and pine filling the house, the laughter of my children echoing off the walls. It used to mean love, unity, and forgiveness. I had spent weeks preparing for that dinner. Every dish was chosen carefully. My son Daniel's favorite glazed ham, my daughter Maya's sweet potato pie, even the old cranberry sauce recipe that my husband Michael used to say reminded him of his mother. I wanted it to be perfect. After all, it had been a hard year. Maybe too hard. And I thought, perhaps foolishly, that one evening together could fix what months of silence could not. But I was wrong. Halfway through dinner, just as I raised my glass to give thanks, Daniel stood up. His hands trembled slightly, his face pale under the soft glow of the chandelier. I thought he was emotional, maybe he wanted to say a toast. But then his words cut through the laughter like a knife through glass. "You're no longer my mother." At first, I laughed. I thought he was joking, some kind of dark humor he must have picked up from his father. But his voice didn't waver. "I mean it," he said louder this time. "You're not my mother anymore." The room went dead silent. Maya gasped. My husband shifted in his chair but didn't meet my eyes. I could hear the clock ticking behind me, every second slicing into my chest. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, I whispered, "Daniel." "What are you saying?" He looked at me then, cold, distant, as if I were a stranger. "You've lied to me my whole life," he said. I know the truth now. My hands went numb. I wanted to ask what truth, but something in his expression froze me. It wasn't anger, it was fear. A kind of trembling fear that didn't belong to him. His voice cracked when he said, "I can't do this anymore," before sitting back down. No one moved. The air felt thick, suffocating. I looked at my husband, searching for any sign that this was some misunderstanding, some emotional outburst that would pass. But he just stared at his plate, his jaw tight, his knuckles white around his fork, and that's when Maya leaned toward me, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom," she said, "don't react. Please, just stay calm." That's when I knew. This wasn't spontaneous. This had been planned. My mind raced. Who would make my own son say something so cruel? Why now, of all nights? And then it hit me, Michael. My husband. He had been distant for months, always on business trips, always shutting me out of family conversations. He had even changed the passwords on our joint accounts, saying it was for security reasons. But I didn't want to believe he could be behind something this cruel. The dinner carried on in fragments after that. Maya tried to change the topic, nervously offering more potatoes, but Daniel barely touched his plate. I sat there, feeling like a ghost in my own home, watching the people I loved the most avoid my eyes. When it was over, everyone retreated quietly. Maya hugged me, tightly but with guilt. "It's not your fault," she whispered. I wanted to ask what she meant, but her tears told me not to. I stayed behind to clean up. Every plate I washed felt heavier than the last. I kept hearing his words echoing in my head. "You're no longer my mother." It didn't make sense. I had raised him, fed him, prayed for him. I had stayed up nights when he was sick, worked double shifts to send him to university. How could my own child look at me and say something like that? Then, as I was gathering the torn wrapping paper from the living room floor, I saw it, something small sticking out from beneath the couch. A photograph. Torn clean down the middle, it was a family photo, one of us from years ago, back when Daniel was a teenager. His smile was bright, my arms wrapped around him. But the other half of the photo was missing. The half that should have shown Michael standing beside us. I felt a chill run through me. Who had torn it, and why? As I turned the piece over, I noticed something faint written on the back in Michael's handwriting. Just one word, proof of what? I felt dizzy, gripping the edge of the table for balance. My mind flooded with questions I didn't want to ask. That word, proof, echoed in my ears like a threat. What kind of proof would make my son disown me? I went upstairs, hoping to find Michael in his study. The door was locked. I knocked once, twice, no answer. But I could hear faint shuffling behind the door. Papers being moved, drawers opening. He was hiding something. When he finally opened the door, his expression was calm, too calm. "It's late," he said. "Go to bed." I held up the torn photo. "Why was this under the couch?" He looked at it for a moment and then smiled faintly. "You're overthinking again." Daniel said, "I'm not his mother," I whispered. "Why would he say that, Michael?" He didn't blink. He just said, maybe you should ask yourself that question. That single sentence shattered the fragile hope left in me. I watched as he closed the study door in my face. And at that moment, I knew whatever had happened tonight wasn't just about anger or rebellion. It was about something far deeper, something that had been buried for years. Downstairs, the lights flickered from the storm outside, casting long shadows across the torn wrapping paper, the half-empty wine glasses, and that single photo, proof of a secret that had lived inside my home all along. I sank to my knees, the photo trembling in my hand, whispering to myself, "What proof? What have you done, Michael?" And I didn't know then. But that photo was proof. Proof of a secret my own husband had hidden for decades. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a museum of ghosts, the kind where everything looks perfect, but you can feel the pain in the air. The days after Christmas were the quietest I'd ever lived through. No clinking dishes, no humming from the kitchen, no soft arguments about leftovers. Just silence. Heavy, choking silence. Daniel had packed up his things and left while I was still asleep. I didn't even get to say goodbye. He didn't take everything. A sweater, some books, a half-empty bottle of his favorite cologne. But what he left behind hurt more than what he took. My husband, Michael, moved through the house like a stranger. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak to me. He'd leave early for work and come home after midnight, pretending to be too tired for conversation. It's strange, isn't it? How a house can still be full of furniture but feel completely empty of life. I'd walk from room to room, touching the things I once loved, the family photos, the embroidered tablecloth my mother left me, and I'd wonder, when did I stop being seen? At night, I couldn't sleep. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, hearing Daniel's words echo over and over. "You're no longer my mother." What could make a child say that? What kind of secret was poisonous enough to turn a son against his own mother? One evening, I found myself sitting at the dining table again, the same place where everything had fallen apart. My eyes landed on that torn photograph I'd kept on the counter. I picked it up, tracing the edges of the rip. That one word written on the back, proof, felt like a challenge. So I turned it over again, holding it under the kitchen light. That's when I saw something I'd missed before. The baby in the picture wasn't Daniel. The eyes, the shape of the face, it was someone else. And in the corner of the photo, faint but clear, was a date. June 1986. That was before Michael and I were married. My heart dropped into my stomach. The photo had been taken years before Daniel was born. But why was my husband holding a baby then? Who was that child? When I showed it to Michael later that night, he barely glanced at it. "You're imagining things again," he said, setting down his briefcase like it was any ordinary day. "You always overanalyze." That word, imagine, felt like a slap, because I had spent years being told that exact thing. When he came home smelling of unfamiliar perfume, "You're imagining things." When money went missing from our account, "You must have miscalculated." When I asked why he spent weekends away, he'd say, "You worry too much." That night, I realized something. Maybe I wasn't imagining anything. Maybe I'd just been living inside his imagination, one carefully built to make me doubt my own mind. But what happened next left me shaken to my core. The next morning, I went to Daniel's room. It was spotless now, too spotless. I opened his drawers looking for something, anything that could explain his words. In the bottom drawer, I found a torn envelope. Inside was a receipt from a storage facility on the other side of town. My name wasn't on it, but Michael's was. The payment had been made just 2 weeks before Christmas. That same day, I drove there. My hands shook on the steering wheel the whole time. When I got there, the man at the counter looked at me suspiciously. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. "The account holder didn't authorize additional access." I forced a smile. "I'm his wife," I said, trying to sound calm. "He must have forgotten to add me." The man hesitated, then said, "He's been coming here every other Friday. Always brings flowers. Sometimes a teddy bear." I remember my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. "Flowers? For who?" He shrugged. "Couldn't say. Never brings anyone with him." When I got home, I asked Michael directly, "Why are you paying for a storage unit?" He froze for a second, just 1 second, and before answering. "Old documents from the company," he said. You wouldn't understand, I knew that tone. It was the same one he used when he wanted me to stop asking questions. But I didn't stop this time. I followed him down the hallway, demanding to know why he was bringing flowers to his files. He turned on me so fast I stumbled. His eyes were cold, hard. "You're paranoid," he said, his voice rising. "You've always been paranoid. Maybe that's why your own son doesn't want to talk to you anymore." Those words burned like acid. He said them so casually, but I saw the satisfaction in his face when I started to cry. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the photo clutched in my hand. I started remembering things I'd buried years ago. The unexplained phone calls, the mysterious letters he used to hide, the way he always made me feel small. And with every memory came the sickening realization that I had ignored so many signs. What would you do if you realized your entire marriage might have been built on lies? The next day, I went searching. I tore through drawers, old shoeboxes, letters from the early years of our marriage. At first, I found nothing but dust and regret. But then, tucked deep inside an old envelope marked insurance, I found something that made my hands go cold. Bank statements. Not ours, another account entirely. The deposits were regular, same dates, same amounts. Each transaction labeled with initials I didn't recognize. And the most recent one was just a week before Daniel's outburst. I copied everything and hid the originals back where I found them. I didn't confront Michael right away. I needed to know more. A few days later, while he was at work, I went through his office drawers again. Inside the bottom drawer, I found a small faded notebook bound with string. Inside were notes, dates, phone numbers, and a name repeated several times. Lydia. My throat tightened. I'd never heard of a Lydia before. But one entry stood out. It read, "Lydia's birthday. Deliver flowers. Don't forget to bring Daniel." My hands went numb. Daniel's name, my son's name, written next to a woman I'd never met. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break every lie he'd built. But part of me needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. That night, when Michael came home, I asked him calmly, "Who is Lydia?" He froze, wineglass in hand. Then he smiled. That infuriating, cruel smile. "You've really lost it, haven't you?" "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice shaking. "Who is she? Why is Daniel's name written next to hers?" He leaned in close, whispering like it was some twisted joke. "Maybe you should worry about yourself, not about things that don't concern you." He walked away, leaving me standing there with tears burning my eyes. That was the moment something inside me broke. I realized I had spent half my life protecting this man, defending him, loving him, excusing him, while he built a life behind my back. A hidden life that somehow involved my son. But the worst was yet to come. Late one night, while cleaning the attic, I knocked over an old box. Papers spilled out everywhere. Old tax files, photographs, letters. And among them, folded neatly in an envelope marked personal, was a birth certificate. My breath caught in my throat as I unfolded it. The name at the top wasn't mine. It wasn't Michael's either. It was Lydia Johnson, and the child listed below? Daniel Michael Johnson. My hands trembled. My knees went weak. The certificate was dated exactly 1 year before Daniel's supposed birth date. I clutched it to my chest, whispering through tears. "What have you done, Michael?" "Who is my son?" And that's when I knew. Everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, my motherhood, was about to collapse. Because that birth certificate, it didn't belong to me, or to him. It belonged to someone else entirely. When I read the name on that birth certificate, I swear my heart stopped beating. The letters blurred as tears filled my eyes. Daniel Michael Johnson. My son's name, but underneath it, written in clean fading ink, was another woman's name. The mother's name. Lydia Johnson, not mine. I blinked, read it again and again, but it didn't change. It didn't make sense. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen, the paper trembling in my hands. And then my knees gave out. I fell to the floor, clutching it, whispering, No, this can't be right." When Michael came home that night, I confronted him before he could even set down his keys. "Explain this," I said, holding the birth certificate out to him. He looked at it for only a second, not shocked, not scared, just tired. Then he sighed and said, "You wouldn't understand. It was for his good." "For his good?" My voice cracked. "What does that even mean, Michael? Who is Lydia Johnson? Why is her name where mine should be?" He didn't answer. He just walked past me, his face stone. "You're digging into things you shouldn't. You always ruin everything when you don't let things go. Those words hit like a knife to the chest. I ruin everything. That's what manipulators say when they know you're getting close to the truth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing his words over and over. It was for his good. What kind of father hides his son's real birth mother for his good? What kind of man builds an entire marriage on secrets? By morning, my hands were shaking, but I knew what I had to do. If Michael wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I started with the hospital where Daniel was supposedly born. The nurse at the front desk looked at me strangely when I gave her the date. She typed something into the computer, frowned, and said, "Ma'am, we don't have a record of that birth under your name or your husband's. Are you sure about the date?" My stomach twisted. I forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, I'm sure. Thank you." But as I walked out of that building, I could barely breathe. Over the next few days, I visited old friends, people who had known Michael long before me. Most of them hadn't heard from him in decades, but one woman, Mrs. Carter, remembered something. She said she used to work at a clinic out of town, around the same time Michael and I were newly married. "He used to come there often," she said, frowning. "There was a woman with him once, dark hair, quiet type. I think her name was Lydia." I remember gripping the edge of my chair, my heart thundering. "Lydia Johnson?" She nodded slowly. "Yes. She was pregnant at the time. I left her house numb, my fingers cold despite the summer heat. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway, unable to go inside. I didn't know what scared me more, the possibility that Lydia was real, or the thought that my son might not be mine. But what happened next made everything worse. It started with the phone calls. The first time, I picked up and heard nothing but breathing. I said hello twice, 3 times, but there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to hang up, a woman's voice whispered my name. "Eleanor." It sent chills down my spine. "Who is this?" I asked, but she hung up. The second call came 2 days later. Same thing. Silence, then my name, soft, almost sorrowful. I tried to tell Michael, but he laughed. "Maybe you're finally losing it," he said, pouring himself another drink. "All that digging around is making you paranoid." That's when I noticed something else, his calm. Too calm. A man accused of something like this would defend himself, explain, argue. But Michael just sat there, smirking like he knew something I didn't. For days, I couldn't focus on anything. I jumped at every noise, every phone ring. My daughter Claire started noticing. "Mom," she said gently one evening, "you look like you haven't slept in days. What's going on?" I wanted to tell her. I wanted to show her everything I'd found. But how could I? How could I destroy her image of the man she still called Dad? So I just smiled weakly and said, "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just tired." But it wasn't nothing. The next Sunday, I went to the church where both my children had been baptized. The old pastor recognized me right away. "Eleanor," he said warmly. But when I mentioned Lydia Johnson, his face changed. "That's a name I haven't heard in years," he said, his voice dropping. "She used to come here briefly, but then she left town. Some said she died. Did she?" I asked. He hesitated. "No funeral was ever held here. I only heard rumors. The word echoed in my mind all the way home. That night, the phone rang again. Same whisper. "Eleanor." But this time, I didn't hang up. I said, "Lydia, is that you?" The line went dead. My blood ran cold. Something inside me snapped. I had to know. I couldn't live in that house another day without answers. So when Michael said he had a business trip out of town the next morning, I followed him. I waited until he left, then got in my car and tailed him from a distance. He didn't go to his office. He drove past the city limits, down narrow roads, until he reached a small, quiet town 2 hours away. He parked in front of an old cottage, one I didn't recognize. Flowers bloomed along the porch, and in the window I saw the faint flicker of a lamp. He got out carrying a bouquet. Red roses. I watched from the car, my heart pounding so loud I could barely breathe. He knocked on the door. A moment passed, and then it opened. A woman stepped out. Even from where I sat, I could see her face. Her hair was streaked with gray, her movements slow but graceful. She smiled when she saw him. He reached for her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run up and demand to know who she was, why he looked at her like that. But then she turned slightly, and I saw something that made my whole world tilt. Behind her, on a shelf by the window, was a photo. It was framed neatly. A younger version of that same woman holding a baby. My baby, Daniel. My stomach dropped. My hands shook violently. Michael leaned in, kissed her cheek, and she said something that I couldn't hear through the glass, but her lips formed one word. Home. And that's when it hit me. He hadn't been visiting a grave all those years. He had been visiting her. The woman everyone thought was dead. The woman whose name was on my son's birth certificate. The woman who was supposed to be gone forever. My breath came in short gasps as tears blurred my vision. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. The two of them stood there, framed by the light of that cottage, like a family I was never part of. And in that moment, the truth hit harder than any betrayal I had ever known. The man I'd loved, the son I'd raised, the life I'd built. All of it had been borrowed from someone else's story. But what happened next proved she wasn't just alive. She wanted me to know it, because when I drove away that night shaking, the phone rang again. I answered, my voice trembling. The same whisper came through the line. Calm, almost tender. Eleanor, she said, we need to talk. And I knew then. The ghost from my past wasn't gone. She was coming back, coming for everything I had left. But the night I followed my husband out of town, I saw something that proved she was alive. She was alive. Those 3 words kept echoing in my mind like a curse I couldn't wake up from. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The night air was heavy, and the only sound was the hum of the gas station lights. And there she was, standing right there under that pale yellow glow. Lydia, the woman I thought was dead. The woman whose grave I had visited every year on the anniversary of her death. She was alive, breathing, smiling, and my husband was running toward her like a boy chasing his first love. I watched him wrap his arms around her. The way his body bent, the softness in his face, I hadn't seen that expression in years. It wasn't just guilt. It was affection, intimacy. And when Lydia's hand reached up to touch his cheek, I felt the world tilt. It was like every lie he'd ever told me was unfolding right there, in front of a flickering gas pump. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My tears had dried out years ago from all the quiet betrayals I'd ignored. But when he turned, when his eyes met mine across that empty parking lot, something passed between us. A silent war. His face went pale. He took one step toward me, then stopped, realizing it was too late. The truth was standing between us now, alive and undeniable. I drove home in silence. My hands shook on the steering wheel the whole way. Every red light felt like an eternity. I kept seeing them. Her smile, his arms around her, that look in his eyes. When I pulled into our driveway, I sat there for nearly 20 minutes before walking inside. The house was dark. The kind of darkness that feels like it's waiting to swallow you whole. When he came in later that night, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the birth certificate and a photo of Lydia spread out in front of me. He froze when he saw them. I didn't shout. I just asked one question, and how long? He didn't even pretend to be confused. He dropped his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and said in that calm, arrogant voice of his, "Does it matter?" Something inside me snapped. Does it matter? You faked a woman's death. You made me believe she was gone. You made me raise her child like my own. He laughed. Actually laughed. And then he said, "You were convenient, Eleanor. That's all you ever were. Convenient." The words sliced through me like glass. For a moment, the room spun. I looked toward the hallway, and there he was. My son, our son, standing there in his pajamas, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He'd heard everything. "Daniel," I whispered, reaching for him, but he stepped back. His voice was small, trembling. "You lied to me, too." It was like being stabbed twice. Once by the man I loved, and once by the child I'd raised. I wanted to scream that I hadn't lied, that everything I'd done was to protect him. But Michael's poison had already done its work. Years of manipulation, of carefully crafted stories, had turned my son against me before I even knew it. That night, after they both went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen for hours. The clock ticked so loudly it felt like a heartbeat. I looked around at the house I'd built, the memories hanging on every wall, birthdays, holidays, laughter, and realized none of it was real. Every happy moment was just another layer of deceit. But when morning came, something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to be their fool anymore. I wasn't going to be the quiet, obedient wife who smiled through betrayal. I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. His name was Martin Hale, sharp, discreet, and with a reputation for exposing the kind of secrets that powerful men thought they could bury. I told him everything. Every document I'd found. Every lie Michael had told. When I handed him the folder of fake death certificates, his eyebrows lifted. "This isn't just betrayal," he said. "This is criminal." For the first time in months, I felt something close to relief. Maybe justice wasn't just a fantasy, but justice, I would soon learn, always demands a price. Michael must have sensed something, because that week he changed. He became colder, quieter, more deliberate. Every time I tried to speak to Daniel, Michael found a way to interrupt, to twist my words, to make me look unhinged. "Your mother's not well," I heard him whisper one evening. "She's been imagining things again. Imagining things. That's what men like him do. They rewrite reality until you start doubting your own memory." One night, I overheard Daniel on the phone in his room. His voice was low, but I caught fragments. "Dad said she's dangerous. He said she's trying to ruin us." I stood outside that door, trembling. Dangerous? After everything I'd done to protect him? But the worst came a week later. Michael's lawyer sent me a letter, a threat disguised as a settlement. He offered money, property, even custody agreements if I stayed silent. But silence had already killed enough of me. I met with Martin again, and this time, I came prepared. I had photographs of Michael and Lydia together, dated after her supposed death. I had financial records, money funneled into accounts under her name. And one document that sealed everything, a property deed. A lake house. Joint ownership, Michael Johnson and Lydia Johnson. Dated 2 years ago. Martin looked at me across the table and said quietly, "Eleanor, when we file this, your husband will lose everything." I nodded. "Then it's time." But the closer we got to court, the more my son drifted away. He barely spoke to me at breakfast. He ignored my messages. When I tried to hug him, he flinched. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't the enemy. That the woman he called mom had been fighting for him his whole life. But his eyes told me he'd already chosen a side. The night before the trial, I sat by his door listening to him pack a bag. "You're staying with Dad, aren't you?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. When he finally turned around, there were tears in his eyes. "You're tearing this family apart," he whispered. I wanted to scream that the family had been torn long before this, but the words got stuck in my throat. All I could manage was, "I'm trying to save what's left of it." He walked past me without looking back. The sound of the front door closing felt like a final verdict. The next morning, the courthouse smelled like old wood and cold air. Michael sat on one side with Lydia beside him, calm, poised, untouched by shame. They looked like a picture from another life, the kind you'd see in a family photo album that didn't belong to you. I took my seat on the opposite side, clutching the file that held years of deceit. I told myself that justice mattered more than pain, that truth would heal everything eventually. But when the doors opened and Daniel walked in, my breath caught. He hesitated for a moment in the aisle, looking between us, between the mother who raised him and the father who lied to him. For a heartbeat, I thought he would come sit beside me. I thought love would win over manipulation, but then he turned and walked to their side. Michael didn't even look surprised. Lydia reached out, touched Daniel's shoulder, and smiled. And that was the moment I realized this battle wasn't just for justice anymore. It was for my son's soul. Because the day we entered that courtroom, he refused to sit beside me and chose them instead. The first sound I remember was the gavel, a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like thunder splitting a quiet sky. My name was called, and for a moment, my legs refused to move. Every eye in that room was on me. Neighbors, co-workers, even the church ladies who used to smile at me every Sunday. And somewhere in the second row sat the people I once called my family. My husband stone-faced and cold, and my son looking at me as if I were a stranger. I stood. My hands trembled around the folder of evidence I'd spent months gathering, pages that could burn the very life we had built. The clerk asked me to swear in, and as I lifted my hand, I could feel my pulse beating in my fingertips. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the voice asked. I swallowed hard. I do. As I took my seat at the witness stand, the air felt thick, almost electric. My lawyer gave me a reassuring nod, but my heart was already somewhere else, somewhere between love and vengeance. I had waited years for this moment, but as I looked across the room and saw my son avoiding my gaze, the victory already felt tainted. The judge's voice broke through the silence. "Mrs. Johnson, please proceed," so I did. I told them everything. I started from the beginning. The forged signatures, the fake insurance claims, the property quietly signed over to Lydia's name under false pretenses. I watched as the exhibits flashed on the projector. Photographs, documents, signatures that didn't match. Each piece of paper felt like a nail sealing the coffin of the life I thought I had. At first, Michael sat there with his lawyer, cool and unbothered, that same confident smirk he'd always used to win over anyone in the room. But as the evidence piled up, the bank statements, the emails, the faked death certificate, I saw the first crack appear. His hand began to shake. Then came the whispers through the courtroom like wind through dry leaves. When I revealed the photograph, the one of him and Lydia dated 2 years after her death, there was an audible gasp. He dropped his pen. The judge adjusted his glasses. And still I kept speaking. Every word cut deeper, not just for him, but for me too. Because with every lie I revealed, I realized just how long I'd been living in a fantasy. And then I turned toward Lydia. She sat there, dressed in pale blue, her face calm, almost saintly. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You let me believe you were dead. You let me raise your child, love your husband, build a life out of your ashes. How do you sleep at night?" For the first time, her mask slipped. She looked down, fidgeting with her ring. And that's when I knew. Guilt had finally found its way to her. But Michael couldn't stay silent anymore. He stood up suddenly, his chair screeching against the floor. "Enough," he shouted. His voice cracked with desperation. "You think you're innocent? You think you're better than us? You stole my son's childhood with your lies." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled. People gasped. The judge had to bang his gavel again. I turned toward him, my voice steady but soft. "I didn't steal his childhood, Michael. I gave him one. While you were busy playing God with people's lives, I was the one who stayed. I was the one who loved him when no one else would." He opened his mouth to reply, but his lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to sit down. He sank into his chair, head in his hands. And that was when it hit me. Beneath the arrogance and deceit, he was terrified. The empire he had built on lies was crumbling, and the world was finally watching. Then came the part I had dreaded most, my son's testimony. When Daniel stood, I could see his whole body trembling. He looked so much like Michael in that moment, it broke something inside me. The clerk asked him to state his name, and then he looked at me, not as a son looks at a mother, but as a witness looks at the accused. The lawyer asked him simple questions at first. "Did you know about the second family? Were you aware of your father's relationship with Mrs. Lydia Hart?" He shook his head, answered quietly. But then came the one question that changed everything. "Do you consider Mrs. Eleanor Johnson your mother?" There was a pause. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel's lips parted. His eyes filled with tears. And then he said it. "She's not even my real mother." It was like the air was punched out of my lungs. The crowd murmured. Lydia's head dropped. Michael looked away. I wanted to move, to speak, to explain, but my body froze. I could only hear his voice, my boy's voice, echoing those words I never imagined I'd hear. I could have shouted back, told him the truth, reminded him of the nights I held him through his fevers, the school plays I never missed, the birthdays I made special when his father forgot. But all I said was, maybe not by blood, but by love, always, silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow the whole room. For a moment I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, pain, confusion. But it vanished just as quickly. He turned away, sat down beside his father, and that was it. I had lost him. After that, everything moved like a blur. The lawyers argued, the judge scribbled notes, the evidence was reviewed. But I wasn't really there anymore. My heart was somewhere between heartbreak and numbness. I barely heard the judge's words when he finally spoke. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, Michael Johnson, guilty of fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Furthermore, The estate and all associated assets are to be transferred to Mrs. Eleanor Johnson. There it was. Justice. The thing I had fought for. The thing that had kept me awake night after night. The thing that had cost me everything. People clapped. Reporters rushed out to call their editors. My lawyer smiled and whispered, "You did it." But I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Michael's head dropped into his hands. Lydia reached over to comfort him, whispering something I couldn't hear. My son just stared at the floor, his face pale and unreadable. And me? I just sat there, staring at the judge, at the papers, at my own shaking hands. The gavel came down again, signaling the end. Case closed. When it was over, I walked out of that courtroom into a crowd of flashing cameras and curious faces. People wanted statements, headlines, sound bites. I said nothing. I just walked past them, down the courthouse steps, into the cold afternoon air. Freedom. That's what everyone kept saying I'd finally earned. But as the wind brushed against my face and I looked up at the gray sky, I realized something I hadn't before. Freedom can be the loneliest feeling in the world. Because when I walked out of that courtroom, I had no one waiting for me. No hand to hold. No voice calling me Mom. Just the sound of heels against stone, echoing through the emptiness. And that's when I understood. Justice can give you peace, but it can never fill the space that love once lived in. I remember the first night after the trial. The air inside that old house felt too heavy to breathe. Every wall seemed to whisper the lies that had been born within them, the laughter that was never real, the love that had been staged. I sat on the edge of the bed where I had once prayed for my family to stay together and realized there was nothing left to save. The silence wasn't peaceful then, it was deafening. But sometimes destruction is what clears the space for rebirth. So I sold it all. Every piece of furniture, every curtain, every framed photo that reminded me of the woman I used to be. When I handed the keys to the new owner, I didn't cry. I thought I would, but instead I felt this strange lightness, like someone had lifted a chain off my chest. I drove away without looking back because for the first time I didn't need to. The road opened in front of me like a blank page, and I promised myself I would fill it with truth. Not illusion. My new home was small, a weathered cottage by the sea, with peeling paint and the scent of salt always drifting through the window. The first few nights were the hardest. I would wake up expecting to hear my son's laughter echoing down the hallway, or the creak of my husband's footsteps sneaking to the kitchen for midnight coffee. But there was only the sound of the waves, steady and eternal. I used to think silence was my enemy. Now I realized it could also be a healer. It stripped me bare. It made me face myself, the woman beneath the wife, beneath the mother, beneath the victim. But what happened next surprised even me. One morning, I found a flyer at the small grocery store near the docks. It said Women's Support Group every Thursday at 7. I almost threw it away. I had told myself I didn't need anyone. I had survived courtrooms, lies, and betrayal. Surely I could survive solitude. But that Thursday evening, something inside me whispered, "Go." So I did. And when I walked into that tiny church basement filled with mismatched chairs and cheap coffee, I saw faces that mirrored my own pain. We weren't just strangers. We were survivors. There was a woman whose husband had faked his job for years, another whose daughter had turned her back on her. One had lost everything to a man who pretended to love her. Their stories broke me open. And for the first time in years, I spoke, not as a woman scorned, but as a woman healing. I told them about the fake death, the lies, the courtroom, the son who no longer called me mama. They didn't judge. They just listened. And in that listening, I began to breathe again. Each week, I found myself looking forward to those meetings. We cried. We laughed. We stitched each other's souls back together with empathy. One night, a woman said something I'll never forget. Pain makes us strangers to ourselves. Healing brings us home. That line stayed with me. Because that's exactly what I was doing. Coming home to myself. Still, some nights, I'd stand on the porch and stare out at the dark sea, wondering where my son was. Did he think of me? Did he believe the lies his father had fed him? I wanted to call, to write, to beg him to remember the mother who had tucked him in and sang him songs. But I knew forcing it would only push him further away. So instead, I began writing letters, one every Christmas. I never asked him to forgive me. I never explained everything again. I just told him the truth that mattered most. You will always have a home if you ever want to come back. There were years when the letters came back unopened. Other years I heard nothing at all. And yet I kept writing. Maybe I was writing for him, or maybe I was writing to remind myself that love, real love, doesn't end when someone walks away. It just learns to wait quietly, without losing itself. The seasons changed. The ocean became my companion. I learned to cook for one, to laugh at my own jokes, to dance barefoot in the kitchen when a good song came on. Freedom, I discovered, wasn't the wild, thrilling thing I once imagined. It was quiet, gentle, sometimes lonely but honest, and that honesty was worth everything I'd lost. One afternoon, after years of silence, I received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, my son standing at the edge of a dock holding a child. On the back, in his handwriting, were just 3 words: "We're doing better." My hands trembled as I held it. I didn't cry this time. I just smiled, because in that moment I understood. Maybe my love had reached him after all. Maybe not through blood, but through the invisible thread. That truth leaves behind. People ask me sometimes if I ever regret exposing the truth. If I could go back, would I choose the illusion of happiness over the loneliness of freedom? And I tell them the same thing every time. Freedom isn't free, but it's the only thing worth paying for. Because once you've lived in lies, even silence feels sacred. Now every morning I walk along the beach and let the tide wash over my feet. I listen to the gulls cry, the waves crash, and I whisper a quiet prayer. Not for the past, not for what I lost, but for what I found, myself. The woman who had once been buried under years of deceit now breathes with the rhythm of the sea. And sometimes when the wind carries the sound of laughter from the nearby town, I close my eyes and imagine it's him, my boy, somewhere, smiling, living, free. That's enough for me. Because in the end, love isn't about possession. It's about release. And that's when I learned the truth. Freedom is the greatest inheritance.